sretna pod suncem, rasti u jaslama dječjim, rasti i cvjetaj zemljo radnih ljudi, i neka mir nad tvojim ljudima vlada, mir tvojim lađama napuči i tvome danu što se vedar budi. Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, окраин, южный гор до северных морей. Человек проходит, как хозяин необъятной родины своей. Тут жизнь невольна и широка, точно Волга полная течет. Молодым везде у нас дорога, старикам везде у нас почет. Никто у нас не лишний, по заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский закон. Этих слов величие и славу никакие годы не сотрут. Человек всегда имеет право на учение, подвиг и на труд. Весенний ветер веет, с каждым днем все радостнее жить. И никто на свете не умеет лучше нас смеяться и любить. Но сурово брови мы насупим, если враг захочет нас сломать. Как невесту родину мы любим, бережем, как ласковую мать.
Greetings, everybody. It is the afternoon live stream from the rather overcast world of South Manchester. And you join us today for a discussion of the departure from this mortal plane of a certain Mr. Alexei Navalny, and various other matters as well, including, of course, the fall of Avdiivka and the always rather disgusting topic of Biden, the man who I think we can all describe now as the butcher of Gaza, because it is, of course, a series of massacres which ultimately belong to him as the man who is ultimately responsible for them. Though, of course, we would be doing a disservice to the disgusting creatures in London if we didn't also name Rishi Sunak as a co-conspirator, Emmanuel Macron, Olaf Scholz, Giorgia Meloni, and various others who have all enabled the litany of crimes committed by the Israeli regime. But we will get to that later on. Our first topic, of course, will be to consider the death of Navalny and who benefits. But before we get to any of that, let us proceed to greet those who are in the chat so far. And if you haven't done so already, as always, be sure to like and share the stream. Be sure to subscribe to the channel. And we will proceed onwards from here. So, Banana Bender, good evening to you, who is on the other end of the world. Have I heard John Helmer on Navalny? John Helmer, of course, the man who writes the blog Dances with Bears. I don't think he's got an article up on it at the moment, but I'm sure he's done interviews on it. I haven't read any of them. I'm sure he's got something interesting to say. I await an article that I'm sure will be forthcoming. Crod, hello. And Jerry, good afternoon to you. Working Prol Inc. says hello from Austria, and hello back to you. And Lee, good afternoon to you. Good to have Jawad with us. And my comrade Jason from the Class Consciousness Project, who says, good afternoon from an overcast Essex. Well, it's an overcast England in general. And by the way, if you're not following the work of myself and my other comrades in the Class Consciousness Project, be sure to do so. I've dropped the link to the website in the chat. And be sure to subscribe to the YouTube page for that, and also the mailing list. Carmo, good afternoon to you. And Eduardo, good afternoon. And DE, who says, afternoon from soggy Hampshire. Jawad's in overcast Dorset. DF says, good afternoon, greetings from Germany. C. Bolt, good afternoon to you. RVA Klavek, who says, good morning, comrades from Detroit. Hello to you out there in Detroit. And Jay has joined us from a bright Norfolk, Virginia. And Tonkinese Cat Fancier says, hi from London. Gillian C. says, greetings from a cold grey Bucharest. Are you noticing that Europe and Britain have the worst weather, it would seem? Greetings to Irish Partisan, who joins us from a wet afternoon in Minsk. And Comrade Hello Hi, who is joining us from, if indeed the comrade stays in one location, as memory serves, the People's Democratic Republic of East Anglia. Martin, who says, greetings this lazy Saturday morning, comrades. And Rob, who says, good evening from an equally overcast Yorkshire. Is it evening in Yorkshire already, Rob? Beans is still chuffed a little mint balls to be here. Well, good to have you with us, comrades. And Martin, who says, overcast all over the world. Good day to catch up on some reading. And Taisa Ivanova, good evening to you. And yes, Comrade Hello Hi confirms that the People's Democratic Republic of East Anglia is indeed where they are resident. So, we are here today to talk about a number of issues, but we will start, of course, with the fate, or the miserable end, however it might have come about, of a certain Alexei Navalny. Now, if you're not familiar with who Alexei Navalny was, we are, for the purposes of this program, assuming that the reports of his death are indeed accurate, but then again, you never know. He was, well, essentially a liberal politician for the most part, who was a member of the Yabloko party, which of course in Russian means apple, and this was the mainline liberal party, constitutional liberal party, who were formed in the early 1990s, and Navalny was one of the, well, he was the up-and-coming young player within it. And it's as a member of the Yabloko party that he first came to prominence. And he only was thrown out of the Yabloko after he'd done one of the campaigns that made him infamous, which is, of course, these what they would call an anti-immigration campaign about 15 years ago now, I think it was, I believe it was. And he became infamous after that. He was kicked out of Yabloko, accused of being a Nazi. And it should be said that Navalny, when he's presented by not just the propagandists in the US-led imperialist bloc, though we will get to them and their coverage of this, he's also presented by leftists as a way in which, in a way which portrays him as a fascist, a far rightist, a man who was, it's basically the way that the leftists deal with him is to say that, oh, well, how can our ruling class claim to support democracy in Russia when they're in bed with this horrific Nazi? Now, it should be emphasized that Navalny wasn't involved with the numerous Russian far-right movements that were far more popular and populous than they are today. About 15 years ago or so, I remember when I was still at university, a friend of mine did her year abroad in Russia and came back saying that these guys, who are a combination of like drinking clubs, various different sort of football hooligan firms, these were quite popular, not in terms of mass movements, but they could mobilize some significant numbers onto the streets, the Russian fascist element. Now, this partly got drained away because many of them ran off to Kiev to be part of the glorious new Maidan regime. In fact, some of them are still fighting for the Kiev regime even now. But they were quite a thing in the Russia of the 90s, which is a Russia of course, wholesale collapse and degeneration brought on by the comprador bourgeoisie. And into the 2000s they were as well. So Navalny, on a basic level, operating as a political opportunist, took up some of their slogans to gain some popularity for himself. Now, it should be emphasized that one of the things, or a couple of the points that he was forcefully making back then, was that Muslim Russians, particularly Chechens and Dagestanis, should be deprived of Russian citizenship. So it's important to remember that, but also important to remember that, well, he wouldn't exactly be the only self-described liberal at the time who was making similar claims. If you opened the pages of particularly some of the more aggressive reactionary press in Britain, openly reactionary press in Britain, so you could find similar opinions regarding Muslims and their place in Britain in the Daily Mail, and you could find it in more polite and restrained language in The Guardian. So again, Navalny, if he is a fascist, which I don't think he ever really was, is basically on the same page as people like Melanie Phillips, a columnist in the Daily Mail, or the various interchangeable liberals in the Guardian opinion pages who were always screaming about how Islam could not be made, had to be made compatible with British multiculturalism, or then it would have to be, well, they would say that unsummoned specified action would have to be taken. Navalny was a little more blunt, but again, like, he was drawing from the same foul intellectual well as many of his contemporaries in the oh-so-free liberal and democratic West. So Navalny, political opportunist, adopted various different slogans at various different times. So the question is, of course, well, why did he go through these various different rebranding operations, from a sort of standard liberal to an apparent like far-rightist, then back to a sort of liberal good governance and anti-corruption campaigner? Well, he was, of course, primarily a political chameleon, but also there is the undeniable linkage to the role of the British, in particular, and American intelligence services, and the whole question of his allegiance to them isn't really in doubt. If you look at his career, he has, of course, been associated, as I've just said, with various different things. Various different points of view he has laid claim to. But the consistent trend is, of course, that he has been promoted relentlessly, certainly for the last decade, as the leader of the opposition in Russia, or Putin's leading critic, which of course has always been untrue. Now, as I've said frequently, the leader of the actual parliamentary opposition to United Russia, which is the party which Putin isn't a member of, or so they say, but he is aligned with, and that is, of course, the party led by Dmitry Medvedev. Now, the opposition to them in the Duma is actually, of course, the KPRF, Communist Party of the Russian Federation. Then its leader is, and has been for the last 31 years, Gennady Zyuganov, frequent presidential candidate as well, and the man who should have won in 1996. Now, when I mentioned this on Twitter the other day, I got a series of responses from people saying, oh, Zyuganov, he's crap, he's an institutional controlled opposition, etc. Now, I've made the point before many times that I have criticisms of the lines taken by the KPRF at various different points, and I believe that there is something of a case to be made that they are, to a certain extent, an institutional opposition, because they are an accepted part of the Russian political system. But I think they're an accepted part of it because they were able to reestablish themselves fairly strongly in the 1990s. And as to the claim that that Zyuganov speaks for the Russian bourgeois, well, if he does, it's a very small section of the Russian bourgeois. The Russian bourgeois, well, those that are politically engaged and make loud nationalist pronouncements, most of those are clustered around United Russia. The compradors are clustered around the various sort of liberal, pro-US NGO operations, or they're exiled. So if there's any bourgeois aligned with the KPRF that I could see, then I would say that they're a very, very small minority. So I don't think that charge is true. It's also the case that the KPRF frequently clash in the Duma and outside of it with the United Russia. They're always raising complaints about United Russia on the regional level, engaging in various dodgy practices at elections, trying to get communists sacked from their jobs, the standard things you'd actually expect from a bourgeois party when faced with a strong communist party, in terms of attempting to stymie their growth, attempting to disrupt their influence, attempting to root them out of workplaces. This is all standard stuff that bourgeois parties do in the so-called democracies all the way around the world. So it's undoubtedly the case, though, that in terms of a major opposition to the party that supports Putin, the answer to who that is the KPRF and its leader Zyuganov. Now, of course, then there's others. There's the LDP, Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, was led for a long time by the late clown prince of Russian politics, Zhirinovsky. And then, of course, there's various other sort of extra parliamentary opposition figures, some of whom are imprisoned. So you've got Sergei Udaltsov in Russia, who is the leader of the Left Front, which includes the KPRF, but also other Russian Marxist forces, who was a supporter of the special military operation, but they locked him up on terrorism charges anyway. I think largely because he was a younger and very effective oppositional figure. And of course, if you look on the other side of politics, the sort of romantic Tsarist side of it, you see the figure of Strelkov, or his real name, of course, being Igor Girkin. And he's imprisoned for, well, not for his reactionary views, but for making, as it turned out, rather accurate criticisms of the Russian political leadership in the special military operation. So there are political prisoners in Russia who are of a much higher profile, who have much greater levels of grassroots support in Russia than Navalny ever did. Yet you never see the name of Udaltsov mentioned in the bourgeois press in Britain or in the United States. I looked and I couldn't find any reference to him. And yet that's a man with a mass organization behind him. And I think Strelkov's imprisonment was mentioned a little bit, but again, not very much at all. So why then promote Navalny relentlessly? Well, the promotion of Navalny is very much a bit of a throwback to the way in which the West handled so-called dissidents in the former USSR. And in Navalny, and the way they've handled him, as I say, very much seems to be in line with that, which is that, first of all, he is whatever his handlers, and I think it's fair to say that the US and the British in particular are his handlers, require him to be at any given moment in time. So if you look back at the way in which the British and the United States, in the early years the British were taking the lead on it, were trying to combat the Soviet Union. What they were doing was they were essentially throwing in their lot with anybody who was in opposition to Lenin and the Bolshevik Party. So they were funding terroristic operations of the Social Revolutionary Party, which was nominally at least a peasant-based populist party, but in reality had been thoroughly infiltrated by the Tsarist Okhrana and was lending its services to essentially anybody who'd pay them some money. So, of course, the SRs were the foot soldiers of the British spy, Sidney Riley. And at the same time, they were involved with monarchists, they were involved with various Russian liberals, they were involved with Menshevik organizations, particularly in Georgia. So the British early on set up the way that this was going to go with regard to fostering opposition to the Soviet Union, which is that they would give money to anybody. Anybody who could move things on the ground, they would get involved with. And later on, post World War II, this meant, of course, that the various chosen men in the people's democracies and elsewhere who were set up as great oppositional figures were people like Havel in the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, later on, of course, Lech Walesa in Poland. And all of these guys were heavily sponsored by the CIA and MI6 and various other institutions of the West. But also there was a real cornucopia of a rogues gallery, shall we say, supporting all of these movements. You got a hell of a lot of Trotskyites, some of whom were used to funnel money to these puffed up oppositional figures. And the same is true here of Navalny, which is that you'd be a fool to think that the only way that the US and the British intelligence services and their governments operate is just one way, and when they're trying to pull down a particular government or a particular party or political figure. They will go with anybody who is controllable, who is disposable, who is able to muster any kind of force against the system, because your only priority is to disrupt the system and force out the bad guys, the guys who are opposing the whole setup in that country. So the question then comes up, what were they doing with Navalny? Now, Navalny was rebranded a couple of times, but they wanted him to be the sort of figurehead for a Russian Maidan. And that's clear from his rebranding as an anti-corruption activist. Anti-corruption has become one of the key ways in which the Western countries, the US and the British-led bloc, go after countries that they want to destabilize. What they do, they did this very effectively in the run-up to the Maidan. They did it also in 2004 in the coup that took place there, which saw Viktor Yushchenko enthroned, was that they play upon legitimate grievances that the population has. So the people who design these programs in London and Washington, they have some abilities. They are able to read some frustrations. And what they wanted to do with the issue of corruption was present it in the manner of, well, this is a bunch of bad, ex-communist guys running corrupt networks and stealing from the people. And there's some truth in that. When it came to Ukraine, look at who was running it for years. Kushma, Kravchuk. Later on, people like, of course, the various different corrupt elements in the Party of the Regions headed by Yanukovych. And a lot of these were ex-communist officials who were very, very corrupt. So they took that truth, of course, and then they, of course, stripped the politics out of it. They present it in an abstract way, and then they link it to, well, the way in which you get a government that is not corrupt, that is answers to the needs of the people, is to have this amazing democracy modeled on so-called Western lines that will take you into the European Union, a place where, of course, no corruption happens, and especially no corruption involving deals with Pfizer over vaccines. Just Google Ursula von der Leyen, Pfizer, and deleted text messages if you want to know more about that. But the point is that you take an issue over which public frustration can be generated. As we've said before when we've covered things like how the West prepares for color revolutions, you take an issue which does resonate. or at least resonates with a certain section of the population. You build up a whole load of organizations and you call them anti-corruption organizations. You recruit a lot of energetic young activist types, particularly from like the petty bourgeoisie or lower bourgeoisie, who are prepared to run around, give them a big budget, get them running around, doing media stunts, Pussy Riot style. And then you present that as a big propaganda piece, usually in the Western press. The hope being, and again, if you want to know more about this, go back and listen to the discussions of color revolutions before. The hope being that all this sort of anti-corruption stunt work can be combined with other things. So let's use the model of the so-called Maidan in Kiev there. That the mobilizations for that, a lot of it was carried out by these nominally liberal organizations who were able to get a lot of younger petty bourgeois pro-EU types out onto the street. But as the right sector guys who've been interviewed about this in Ukraine say, well, without the Nazi element, there's no muscle. And so you have the Nazi element there. Essentially, they only come out of the shadows when they only need them as muscle. And the hope is that the combination of the sort of political stunt making of the various different liberal NGO types, good governance organizations, anti-corruption activists, who their job is to run around, get arrested, and have younger people who can make say good shots for the Western cameras, martyr themselves by getting arrested. They get an overreaction, violent reaction out of the state forces, and then, of course, what happens is, and again, like the people like Gene Sharp who came up with this type of thing aren't stupid. They know how political momentum is built. What you do is then that you hope that you can then at least call out the various discontented elements that are always there within capitalist societies, and that then you can use political weaknesses and divisions within the ruling group to cause hesitation and to cause fatal delays in the way that a response is brought out by a government which is largely oligarchic and has a very, very weak, if possibly no connection with the masses. And then you are able then to have that government on the run, particularly if you've got sympathizers within the ruling class. And this is indeed the way in which the Maidan in 2014 was carried out. Same model was planned for Russia, and Navalny was meant to be at the center of it. Whether he would be the man in the end that the West chose to enthrone is another matter entirely. The West, as always, with its particular chosen puppets, always regards them as disposable. You're always regarded as an asset until you're not. If you become a liability, or it's better that they dispose of you, then they'll dispose of you. There's absolutely no sentimentality attached to any of these people. Just look at how they've treated the Kurds over many, many years of manipulating their struggle and getting them to fight for imperialism. They'll pull the plug on them in the end. They always do. So with regards to Navalny, the question comes up. Okay, so he dies in the far north of Russia in this prison. He had reportedly been unwell. So far, the official account from the Russian authorities says that he went for a walk after complaining of feeling unwell and was found collapsed, and his death was blamed upon a blood clot that had come loose and had entered into his system and killed him. So that's the official story. It could be true, but there was footage of Navalny from just a couple of days, indeed 24 hours before his death, where he seems to be in fairly good spirits and he's laughing and joking in the court room that he's in. So can a man go from laughing and joking, a fairly young man to be said? I mean, he was 47, so not exactly a guy in his 20s, but not overly old, and apparently had suffered from health problems, so they say. But again, the truth and the lies about with regard to Navalny's background are always hard to pick apart. But it is possible that a man can, if he's subjected to harsh conditions, it can exacerbate pre-existing health problems. It could lead to things like blood clots, death from heart failure, various other things associated with circulatory and circulatory problems, anything involving death via stress-induced conditions. All these things can happen. So it's eminently possible that the explanation provided by the Russian authorities is correct. So what about other explanations? Let's look at the explanation which is, of course, being provided by the bourgeois press, which is very useful to observe them during these times because they are now absolutely uniform in their glowing tributes to this man who seems to be a combination of, some sort of martyr for liberal democracy and perhaps even a holy one. And they want to make him into the new Václav Havel, their previous favorite puppet. Of course, it never really quite worked with Navalny. Now, they are presenting his death, of course, as a machination of the evil one, of Putin, who just killed him because he was so damned threatened by Navalny's presence and his strong stance for democracy, etc., etc., etc. Now, is it conceivable that someone inside the Russian state system, if not Putin himself, then somebody else, because, again, like the idea that Putin controls everything that's going on inside such a vast and complex country is ludicrous. You couldn't even run Britain as that kind of dictator. It's simply not the case that anybody ever could. So it's the whole question of like, well, are there enemies of Navalny inside the Russian state system? Well, arguably, yes. Uncontestably, I would say yes. And is it conceivable that somebody inside the Russian state system decided to off him and come up with this as a cover story? Yeah, it's possible. Putin might not know anything about it. Navalny will have enemies dotted all over the Russian state system. But then again, it does rather raise the question as to why now. Given that Navalny was likely to be rotting away in a Russian prison for another 10 years, 20 years, I think the idea was, if the Russian authorities had a clear plan, it was to keep him basically away from the cameras for as long as it took for him to be forgotten, and then perhaps release him when the West has long since moved on. So if you're going to go with this explanation, then you need to establish a motive. So what motive would the Russians actually have for doing him in now? He wasn't likely to get released. Their plan was seemingly that they were just going to keep him in the prison system for as long as it took for him, as I said, to be forgotten. Given that the Russian armed forces in Ukraine are very much on the front foot, Putin as a political figure has just had, I would say, on balance, a political triumph via his interview with Carlson, and his words are being heard by millions and upon millions of people. I think it's like over 1 billion views on that video that he did with Carlson, the interview. So again, Putin is on the political front foot. The Russians are on the military front foot. Why on earth would they give juice to the Western propaganda machine by offing Navalny, not just in this period, but right at the beginning of the Munich Security Conference? Why on earth would you do that? Even if your plan was to kill him, in the end, surely nobody would accuse Putin now, seriously, and his system of acting wildly and irrationally. The opposite would be true. They're very, very cautious characters. So the question is, well, why on earth would they do it? And the answer is, I don't think that they would. I think that if you look at the way in which, of course, that this fell, the timing of it, it's not something that the Russian authorities would want to do at this moment, given that they're, again, in a good political position, in a good military position. The Western alliance, led by the United States, is in increasing chaos and dispute over what the hell they're going to do to keep Ukraine going. So given all of that, given that you've just had this very positive political and military week, why on earth do you then do something which especially the British and the US propagandists will use to try and essentially continually whip the opposition bloc to you, the NATO bloc, into shape again, using Navalny's corpse as emotional blackmail? Why would you do that? Again, the only way you can believe that the Russians decided to off Navalny now is if you believe in the propaganda stories of the West that Putin is just this wild, blood-crazy madman who just wakes up one morning, gibbers a bit, and decides to just to kill somebody before breakfast for sport. So it's not conceivable, I don't think, that the Russian government or the Russian authorities themselves ordered his death. Not at this stage. Now, you might say that, well, they locked him up. They are responsible for it. And if you want to go down that line, I suppose you could make that argument. But then, of course, you couldn't go down that line and make that argument if you were indeed a supporter of the regimes in London and Washington, because you want to talk about political prisoners. Well, there's quite a number inside the United States. There is, of course, a very famous political prisoner whose final appeal day is coming up, and that is, of course, Julian Assange, who, unlike Navalny, isn't an agent of any foreign power. He was a guy who was an idealist of the early to middle period of the internet age, you would say, a man who wasn't aligned with any government, and as a consequence of which has paid the price for it. So that's a genuine oppositionist and a genuine political prisoner. Navalny was an agent of the CIA and MI6. That is why he is imprisoned, or was imprisoned. And again, though, it's not likely, I'm not saying it's completely impossible, but it's not likely that the Russian political leadership ordered his death. It is just simply not in their interest to do at this moment in time. So who, if indeed we say that the official explanation of his death isn't correct, but, it's conceivable that it is entirely down to natural causes. Certainly, the way in which the British and the American propaganda machine has cranked into high gear to exploit his death lends us a certain credibility to the idea that if anybody had motivation to remove him from the scene now, it's his old friends. Although, of course, being a friend of America is very dangerous, to paraphrase Henry Kissinger. So, if you look at the way in which this has been covered, Navalny painted as like a latter-day Russian saint, a martyr for freedom and democracy, a man who was just too damn freedom-loving for that inadequate, bloodthirsty, raving, dribbling maniac Putin, who just had to kill him for some reason right now. Again, the way in which they are seeking to utilize his death is quite interesting. It's a question of studying the way in which the narratives have formed. So the narrative now taking center stage in the United States and in Britain is Navalny the martyr, Navalny the man who was killed by the maniac. And more specifically, the propaganda is being used to target anybody who's opposed to, guess what? Continual funding for the war on Russia via Ukraine. That's immediately what the British press came out with. Mike Johnson, or Michael Jackson, the Speaker of the House, is a coward for refusing to pass the funding bill and stand up to Putin. If I hear that phrase one more fucking time, I'm going to punch somebody. This is the line that they're taking. They are now using Navalny's death to try and batter down opposition to the bill that is stalled going through the US Congress. That's what Navalny's death is being used for. And I have to say, when you put together the circumstantial evidence, it certainly seems that his old friends would be the ones who would profit the most from his death, as I say. So what do you have in terms of the political situation facing the US imperialist bloc? You have, domestically speaking, in the United States, an institutional jam, which is that the Trump supporting elements within the House and Senate Republican Party are repeatedly blocking any further funding for Ukraine, partially because they are, of course, derived from a bit of the ruling class that the lower part of the bourgeoisie and the regional American bourgeoisie and the upper petty bourgeois, who don't benefit anything like as much from American imperialism as the highest elements of the bourgeois. So there's them, and for their own reasons, class-based reasons, who aren't fans of this Ukraine war and haven't been from its very inception. So there's them. There's also the political game that's going on between the Republicans and the Democrats, which is that the Republican Party and the people who run the strategy for it, partially Trump, but mainly Trump's advisors, I think, have come up with the idea that if they can basically get Biden to sign off on, like, essentially Trump's border policy, then not only will that help them, but it will fuck Biden and any Democrat who signs up to it. So by tying the Ukraine money to the border question, they've essentially snookered the Democratic Party, who can't go forward in terms of actually getting the Ukraine money unless they fully sign up to the Trump-inspired border policy, which would, of course, cause enormous problems for the Democrats, more so than they've got now, or perhaps adding to the gigantic problems they've made for themselves over the Palestine question, with regard to their younger leftist voters who went with them last time, abandoning them en masse. And if they adopt the Trump-inspired border policies that the GOP, particularly in the House, are demanding that they do, then that's a huge further political blow to them. So they have immediately jumped on this to say that, well, now or the House GOP has to back down. They have to pass the bill allowing for the transit of money to Ukraine, because this is all about standing up to Putin. And if you don't stand up to Putin, he'll go and murder other prominent liberal celebrities who are in prison. So that's how it's being used. You can see it all in the British press. You can see it all over the place. I mean, the level of so-called discourse in the bourgeois press now is like, it's like looking at a parallel fucking universe, to be honest. You see all these like clueless ex-spook types and ex-soldiers on British TV going like, well, the thing about Putin is a lot of people around him die. And I'm thinking to myself, to paraphrase Donald Trump, we got a lot of killers here. We kill people all the time. And I'm just thinking, well, there's no one more blood-soaked than most British prime ministers. Putin's an amateur by comparison. So this is how his death is being used. First of all, in the United States, to try, via the usage of Navalny's corpse to bludgeon the Republicans with, to try and overcome institutional opposition to further Ukraine funding. I don't think that's going to work. I think that the people who hold the balance of power in the House Republican caucus especially, they won't give a fuck about Navalny. He was a project basically of principally their political opponents in the United States. Why would they and their constituency that they're serving give two shits about the death of this guy? It's not going to work. Now, it may cause the House Republican leadership to wobble, but then again, Johnson's got to look at the choice between being more acceptable on the DC dinner party circuit or keeping his job. And if he starts wavering on the Ukraine question, well, keeping his job might be rather of a tall order if the Marjorie Taylor Greenes in it and people like that turn on him. So I don't think it's going to work, but they're going to try and milk this for all it's possibly worth. The other big thing, of course, aside from institutional problems facing the Biden administration in the United States, is, of course, the Munich Security Conference, where arguably a lot of this began over 2 years ago now, just over 2 years ago, where Zelensky made an insane speech about Ukraine possibly acquiring nuclear weapons. Now, who put him up to that is another question entirely, which perhaps we shall come back to on future episodes. But the Munich Security Conference needed to have a narrative, and it needed to have a way for the British and the Americans in particular, but also the French and German hardline elements, to push for a continued commitment to the war in Ukraine. Now, how are you going to do that? It's the question of like setting, when you have to set a political agenda, particularly when you're facing a difficult set of realities. How do you do it? Now, you can't now, considering Avdiivka's just fallen, as we'll cover in just a moment, you can't then say Ukraine is winning, because it's obviously not true. So you need another narrative. So what's the narrative? Well, can we say that Zelensky is the great hero? Well, that's getting a bit old. It's getting a bit tired. No one really believes that anymore. He's looking a bit wiry, a bit, shall we say, squirrely, from his, shall we say, enthusiastic usage of Colombia's favorite export, or I should say the Colombian drug baron's favorite export. So that's Zelensky. You know, it's kind of, his stock has faded. It's not really working anymore. We can't really wheel him out as the great T-shirt clad hero. So that's not really working. We can't really acclaim anybody from the Ukrainian military anymore. That's not working either. So what else do we need? What they need in political terms out of the Munich Security Conference is an agreed unified position. So they need the Europeans and the United States to be able to sign up to some new commitment to Ukraine. And you can see that this has been taking shape over the past couple of weeks, with Sunak signing an utterly pointless and empty non-treaty with Ukraine, committing Britain to defend Ukraine in the future, and Ukraine to defend Britain as well. Though, in fairness, the Ukrainian army is probably much larger and much more capable than the British army is at the moment. And you get Scholz and Macron doing a similar thing, signing up to these meaningless treaties that will never be called upon. Or even if Ukraine tried to call upon them, suddenly Zelensky would find that no one was picking up the phone in Paris, Berlin, or London. So what's shaping up here is the idea that they are desperately seeking to keep Ukraine afloat, and that means putting more confidence in the system. Now, they had a bit of a wobble trying to decide whether they were going to continue to back the Z-Man, but again, they've got very little choice, because all the other options are either worse or wouldn't be accepted. So they can't just turn to Zelensky via a coup, because that wouldn't look very good. They can't just have bad old guy Petro Poroshenko come back again via a coup, because again that would look bad. So they need to reinstill confidence in the Ukraine project. So they've tried doing the argument that, well, you know, we're fighting them over there, so we don't have to fight them over here, as Beddoes, the woman from the Economist, the editor of the Economist, said to Jon Stewart the other day. So what are they going to try and do? They're going to try and use the death of Navalny to say, look, the war in Ukraine is at a critical phase. We must aid Ukraine, because look at what kind of man this Putin is. He is nothing more than a murderer. If you do not agree to help Ukraine, you are objectively aiding Putin. You are aiding the murderer. How dare you aid a murderer? Have we told you he's a murderer? He's a murderer, you know. He kills people. You can see how it goes. And you can see how this political operation works. Like, you can, if you recall, Putin speaking with contempt about the pressure that the Bush administration was putting on the European powers over the supposed admission of Georgia and Ukraine into NATO, Putin responding to them with contempt, and deserved contempt, it must be said. But the way in which this political pressure operation works is that, of course, that all these leaders who are at the Munich Security Conference, they'll all be visited in private by teams from the British delegation and the American delegation, who will basically just say what I've just said to you. It's like they will present a dossier proving that Putin killed Navalny, and they'll say, well, you don't want to be seen as siding with just a thug, do you? You don't want to be seen as not standing up for democracy, do you? You want to be on the right side of this, don't you? Implying strongly, of course, that if you're not on the right side of it, then further action will follow. We know that they've got people in place, or organizations in place, to try and lever out Orban, which is a great joke, considering that Orban was a recipient of money from Soros in the past, and an ally of the US in the final destruction of the Hungarian people's democracy. But now, of course, he's proven to be have rather too much of an independent political base, and they've decided that he needs to go. Again, like if there was a serious threat of workers' uprisings in Hungary, they'd be back on side again. But as things are where they are, they've decided that even Orban's oppositional stances, which has never really been that he's never really been able to be that hardcore with it, but even that's too much. And so therefore, let's try and exert pressure on him, possibly lever him out, but I don't think they're going to get much success in that. The point is that they will use this to exert as much pressure as possible to get themselves a fully unified position on Ukraine by the end of the Munich Security Conference, which will probably mean being able to announce a whole load of new money. And this is the aim of the operation that's taking place in the United States, getting the Republicans to back down. Again, I don't think that's going to work, though. The U.S. press and the U.S. political system, including the pro-NATO elements within the Republican Party, will go all out to try and force this through now. Again, I don't think the Trump elements are going to go for it, to be honest. But they'll certainly try. But they'll certainly want, by the end of the Munich Security Conference, to be able to say, we are giving X number of billions to Ukraine. We are giving this number of weapons to Ukraine. We commit that Ukraine will reconquer all of its territory from the 1991 borders, etc., etc., etc. The aim is to have a big photo call at the end where everyone's positive. Zelensky is acclaimed again, even though nobody really believes that he is the great leader. And everybody then goes home feeling like they've done a good job. And that's what the usage of Navalny's death is for. It's what his corpse will be employed to do. And if you look at the way that this has been covered, and also I saw a claim on one Telegram channel, it was the Russian diplomat Telegram channel, that Navalny's missus, his other half, had been claiming that she was a widow for many, many years now, which is quite interesting. And she was there to play the part of the grieving wife whose husband had been stolen from her by Asiatic totalitarianism, etc. And she was there with like Nancy Pelosi and various others. So it's clear that she's an asset being deployed by Western intelligence services. This is undeniably the case. So the whole theatre around this and the whole usage of it and the way it's fallen for them leads me to believe that, again, if Navalny was indeed killed, that they are the far more likely suspects than the Russian government are. And even if his death was purely natural causes, then at the very least they had a whole system in place, a whole propaganda system ready to go, a whole series of messages ready to go in time for their security conference when they really needed to secure maximum unity amongst themselves, when they needed to batter down domestic opposition inside the United States. The death of Navalny really came at just the right moment when they needed it. It fell perfectly for them. Now, do you believe in consequences? So I don't necessarily do. In terms of the way that this has happened, the way in which that this has flowed for them very, very nicely, has me believing that the prime suspects for this are his old friends, as I said, are the people in the Western world, because the timing of his death could not have been more opportune for them. And what better way to end his long career in service of US and British imperialism than by dying for them? And I don't think that they would hesitate for a moment in looking at, when they're desperate and looking for a way to enact some sort of plan to further their aims in Ukraine and unify their bloc again against dissent, than to off Navalny and say, look, Putin's a murderer, you got to stick with Ukraine, otherwise you're next, etc. So again, the natural causes story could be true. I very much doubt that the Russian government has certainly the leadership of it has the motivation to do Navalny in now. I don't think that there's a coherent case to be made that they've done this. Is it possible that Navalny had other enemies inside the Russian state structure or in various other private entities that were determined to do him in? Well, maybe. But the biggest suspects sit in Washington and London. And they will have, of course, connections still within Russia, enough of a series of connections to kill some prisoner who, again, nobody really gave that much of a fuck about. You notice that there's some tight angle shots of like young demonstrators getting arrested in Moscow and St. Petersburg over this, but this is the way they always cover issues like this within Russia. They always do some sort of small-scale demonstration where the BBC and ITN will be there with a tight angle shot to make it look as if it's massive. In actual fact, it's about 100 people. And they will try and portray that as representing Russia. Of course, it doesn't. Russia, as anybody who looks at a map will know, is this vast country with over 150 million people in it that, again, is not represented wholly by St. Petersburg and Moscow. It wasn't in the days of Dostoevsky, and it certainly isn't now. Right, okay, we have various different comments coming in. So where are we right now? Okay, well, hello to Peter, who's joining us from Perfidious Albion and is just catching up at 2 times the speed. Albert Roundtree says the Western toad finally croaked. Banana Bender says, I think liberalism in Russia used to be about monarchy and constitutionalism. Well, it did in the early 20th century, certainly. I think in recent years it's about, well, the actual liberals were about sort of free market and, to a lesser extent, constitutionalism. The Constitution, they wanted like a more, shall we say, typically US Constitution, not the Bonapartist one that Yeltsin put in place. But they never really got anywhere, and quite deservedly so. Russian liberals are like the most completely pointless individuals in the world, even more pointless than liberals in Britain. KPRF says, Irish Partisan, are Brezhnevite in nature as its leadership grew up during the era of stagnation, as reflected in their policies. The same can be said about the Communist Party of Belarus. Yes, that's true. I'd probably vote for both, either of them if I was in Belarus or Russia, but you'd be, as Irish Partisan says in his comment, you'd be foolish to think that these are parties which don't have their limitations. They certainly do. Battle Cossack says, if you mix Yeltsin and Poroshenko, you get Navalny. Good point. Red Star Betty, good afternoon to you. Irish Partisan says, I think ruling elites in Russia are afraid of Udaltsov and Gherkin because they don't want a rerun of 93 when the left and right joined together to challenge Yeltsin. They are young and charismatic. Well, certainly Udaltsov and Gherkin represent far more than Navalny ever did. The two of them represent coherent, well, if not coherent, then certainly stronger challenges to the system run by Putin than anything that the West has sponsored. And the West noticeably doesn't want anything to do with either of them. Because whatever you might say about Strelkov is that, well, he's certainly not a tool of the West, and certainly he was crucial in the early stages of the Donbass rebellion, for his own reasons, going down there and supporting it. And that should be recognized. So, yeah, they don't want anything to do with him. They certainly don't want anything to do with Udaltsov, because they recognize that neither of these men would be willing to be their pawns, and both of them, of course, backed the special military operation and wanted it to start much earlier than it did. Tim Gray says, join late, so if this question has been answered, don't worry. Was his death an attempt to kill off the Tucker interview by changing the narrative? I think that's part of the motivation here, changing the narrative, but also whipping the NATO bloc into shape, and also using the death of Navalny to try and batter down U.S. domestic opposition to further funding for the war in Ukraine. RVA Clavex says, color revolution tactics are so transparent you have to be willing to be lied to. Yeah, that's true. That's true. But also, I've discovered since I started covering this, like the way in which, particularly in like petty bourgeois sections of the population of the former Soviet countries, the way in which these people are willing to believe that the streets of London are paved with fucking gold or something is really astonishing. Like, the power of the Western propaganda machine it has to be seen to be believed. But you are right, you have to be willing to be lied to. It also has to be the case that the working class has little if no role, or is very much suppressed. Therefore, the only ideology that gets put around is either the ideology of a decaying oligarchic regime and the more well-funded ideology of US imperialism. Just look at how they've operated in Armenia, for instance, where they basically got their way with this fucking moron, Pashinyan, who, again, he was very, very, very similar to Navalny in that he was willing to say and do anything to get himself into power. And also, then, once he got into power, proved himself to be just a stooge of the West, but a loud and over-the-top stooge. But also that they got him over the line by funding a myriad of different so-called civil society organizations in Armenia, which basically took over the media sphere in Armenia. And so you've got, again, legitimate frustrations with this sort of oligarchic regime in Yerevan, tapped into by a complete reactionary adventurer and leader of the worst elements of the compradors. Again, like, this is sort of the unfolding still of the end of the Soviet Union, which is that the authority and the power of the old Communist Party was collapsed by its own leaders, who then, many of whom, moved into power and stole everything. And then you get these sort of oligarchic regimes that emerge out of it, which are based on a sort of foundation of the security services and sometimes the militaries, but also are very weak in terms of connections with the masses, and therefore it's comparatively easy for the US to build these civil society organizations up and recruit people, especially when they're able to insist on complete freedom of operation for their organizations as part of their doing business with these regimes. So, for instance, like, you're now seeing, like, Kyrgyzstan, government of Kyrgyzstan start to regulate these NGOs. And then Blinken immediately jumps up and says, well, that'll affect relations. Because finally, the post-Soviet governments are realizing that, oh, right, okay, well, it doesn't matter how much we compromise with the West, they will come for us in the end. So they're now starting to finally go after the NGOs. But again, after 30 years of them running rampant and doing whatever the fuck they like, they're going to have a bit of an hard job getting rid of them. Again, to actually uproot imperialism, to actually uproot the influence of the US, then it can't be done by some administrative measure, by, again, an oligarchic regime. You'd have to do it via revolutionary means. That's the most effective way of doing it. Because, again, you have to change the system entirely and get rid of capitalism if you want to get rid of the sources of the sympathy for the Western imperialist bloc. And the sources of that sympathy aren't just propaganda, they are the capitalist mode of production itself. So, no connection with the masses. You just described the British government, says Albert. Well, that's true. No one's trying to do a colour revolution here, though, at the moment. Irish Partisan says, I knew early on that 2020 protests in Belarus were a colour revolution because all the info for the protests to organise and tactics were broadcast on Telegram channels like Next, Current Time, etc. Yes, well, they put a lot of effort into developing those things. On Any Sundry Mule says, sometimes people just have heart attacks or some such stuff happens, but did Navalny insist upon a Western farmer shot as one of his freedoms? Well, did he have Pfizer? Irish Partisan continues regarding the Telegram channels he's talking about. They are controlled and funded by Polish and US governments. Same thing as the human rights NGOs. They took control of legitimate grievances and attempted to steer them to the benefit of US imperialism. Very true. Battle Cossack says, I'm telling you, Russia has replaced North Korea as the country corporate media loves to portray a crazy totalitarian. I can already see the headlines, Putin forced everyone to have the same haircut. Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's quite replaced that. I mean, the coverage of the DPRK is rather curious because quite a lot of the time they just don't cover it at all. So the Russia thing is always going to be bigger because the prize in Russia is much bigger. And like now, I mean, you've had these stories about Putin, apparently offing people in the most inefficient way possible for over 20 years now. I mean, the first one that I remember the narrative about Putin changing almost as soon as he came into power, that he was some sort of shady Soviet or Tsarist revanchist. That was stories about that were around in 02, 03. And then you then get the things like the Skripal events later on, and then you get the you get various different sort of assassinations. So some of them were people who were thoroughly disgusting individuals, like Boris Berezovsky and other characters like that, where they try to drum up some sympathy for them. Then you find out that it was all about defending some Russian oligarch who had very close ties with various different British government figures. But the big one was, of course, Litvinenko, 2006, another ex-KGB guy who had been essentially in business with the West, who supposedly died after having polonium slipped into his tea by a guy called Andrei Lugovoy, who... It was supposedly, I mean, this is always the ridiculous the stories they come up with about apparently he'd carried around a bunch of polonium and then just put it in Litvinenko's tea, then died like a hideous death. And I always think, well, why on earth do the supposedly hyper-efficient, deadly Russian special services choose to kill people via carrying around radioactive poisons or like sloppily applying nerve gas agents that are very easily detected? Like with there's Litvinenko, and then there's the Skripal thing, which again is this whole bizarre series of incidents which, once you start to examine it, you can't help but think that the whole thing seemed to be some kind of massive psychological operation being carried out. But the point that there's always at the basis of these things, the point that they always operate off, is that these are manipulations principally for a Western audience. Putin, well, he's just mad. Why is he trying to poison people via the application of polonium into a guy's tea at the Ritz or whatever the fuck it was with Litvinenko? Well, he's just mad. Why is Putin or the Russian government trying to poison Sergei Skripal and his daughter? Well, via the application of Novichok to the door handle of their house or something, or their car. Well, he's just mad. The reason why they constantly try and underline the point that Putin is a maniac is because the only way you could believe all these stories about him is if you believe that he is just a lunatic, a sort of frothing at the mouth madman who's stamping around in the Kremlin and shouting and screaming that he must have his enemies killed in the most inefficient and easily detectable way possible. Martin says pulmonary embolism is one of those things that can suddenly strike and kill younger people. That's very true. HM says we're meant to believe that Putin loves carrying out assassinations at the same time as key PR events for Russia. Salisbury was right before the Russian World Cup. Navalny after the Tucker interview. Yeah, it's exactly the right point to make. Irish Partisan says the 2020 protests at the start projected the image of families out for a peaceful protest, but then more hardline neo-Nazi elements fled to Ukraine and formed their own military battalion. Yeah, there's been plenty of dead Belarusian Nazis in Ukraine. And had, by the way, Tikhanovskaya succeeded in Belarus, Belarus would have been reduced to the same status as Ukraine, which was that all the positives from the Lukashenko era, and there are a number, such as the preservation of key Belarusian industries and the relative strength of the institutional, possibly, opposition of the Communist Party, the relative strength of the working class in certain areas, would have all been destroyed by mass deindustrialization, privatization, mass asset transfer out of the country, and the only thing that would have been left for Belarus would have been turning it into cannon fodder against Russia. That's what the great liberal Tikhanovskaya would have brought to Belarus. And again, no matter what problem you may or may not have with Lukashenko, if it's the choice between him or these complete comprador swines that are backed by the West, you'd pick him every time. Because, again, whatever issues that he might have, at least he's preserving certain positive things in Belarus and not just turning it into essentially a shield for the West to be used to try and batter the Russians with. which only invites destruction, as Ukraine is finding out. Right. Lisa says, as an American, it's embarrassing and disheartening to know that most people buy the propaganda narrative. I would say that when it comes to who buys it, there's certain divisions here. I think the principal target for the propaganda in the United States and Britain isn't really the working class as such. It's elements in the lower bourgeois and upper petty bourgeoisie. Those are the people who I think that they want to keep on board and in line. I don't think they really give a fuck about the opinions of the working class. So I think it's always important to identify where the propaganda is being targeted at. And I think in this case, it's a propaganda targeted at the middle layers. The West's obsession with information management has reached such crude levels of propagandistic lying that it's almost become self-parody. Yeah, Peter's point is entirely correct. The way in which they've gone into overdrive about Navalny is so transparent. It's so obviously a pre-prepared operation. Irish Partisan says the West's lionizing of Navalny will be the equivalent of Russia and China eulogizing Tommy Robinson. Well, much like Navalny, Tommy Robinson is whatever his masters need him to be, but of course he is a dedicated servant of the British ruling class. But Irish Partisan's point is essentially correct. US equals division, 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 says Lisa, and that's correct. Irish Partisan requests impressions of Joe Biden and Tom Perez. Well, stay tuned, you might get them. I'm not giving all the good stuff just on request. You have to hang around and you have to make sure the stream goes above 100 concurrent viewers. Albert says the West are experts at signing treaties which they have no intention of keeping. That's very true. New Ukraine narrative, says Martin. Dolch Stross. Libs are going to stick with the classics. Yep. Right, so we've slipped slightly too far ahead. Irish Partisan says, Dima from the Military Summary Channel said that the reason why the Europeans and Biden took Zelensky out of Ukraine was because they fear a coup from the Ukrainian military, given the fallout from Avdiivka. Well, that's conceivably true. I mean, there's clearly divisions within the Ukraine leadership now, given how badly things are going. So there's reasons for them to safeguard Zelensky. If there is the threat of that, though, I'm willing to bet that the US and the British are going to be moving a lot of money into various generals' pockets inside Ukraine and saying, look, chaps, don't make any trouble, stick with Mr. Z, and we'll make sure that you get a villa next to him in Miami, or maybe a penthouse in London. So, yeah, it's certainly possible that given that Avdiivka has fallen and the whole thing is going exceedingly badly and nobody really knows what to do, that they feared somebody might put a bullet in Zelensky. So what they'll try and do, again, using this Navalny incident, is present a great and glorious narrative at the end of the Munich Security Conference. There will be a big photo call with Zelensky, big announcement, loads of new weapons incoming, loads of new money incoming. Not yet, though. Don't worry, chaps, we've got you, as long as it takes, etc. Got to stand up to Putin, and that'll be it. And they'll try, that will be their way also of trying to sort of bolster him and send him back into Ukraine with a whole bunch of promises. I mean, there was one ridiculous story the other day about they're going to send 3D printing technology to Ukraine to print off weapons. And well, unless they can print themselves off an air force, it's not exactly going to work. I mean, we've just reached ridiculous levels of propaganda now. Okay, the viewing level has gone over 100, so here comes a Joe Biden impression. Now, I want you to bear in mind that Joe Biden has done something truly extraordinary over the past couple of days. He has managed to conduct himself in a way that his old friend Strom Thurmond would have been incredibly proud, which is, of course, he has done possibly the most racist political ad since the Willie Horton ad, used against Michael Dukakis back in 1988, which is Joe Biden goes to a black family's household and buys them some fried chicken. But he doesn't eat the chicken with them, of course. He has something different. And it is the most ludicrous, the most embarrassing thing that you could possibly think to do. And the only two explanations I can think of for why anybody thought this was a good idea was A, that it was Biden's idea himself. Hey, man, I'm in a bit of trouble. You know what? I need to secure that black vote. I better go and buy somebody some chicken. Maybe it was Biden's own idea. Doubt it, but maybe. Or if it was the idea of his team, they are either the biggest bunch of incompetent, racist buffoons you could possibly imagine. Again, possible. Or this was done basically to make Biden look even more ludicrous and completely fuck him so that he has to drop out at the opportune moment so they can install American Psycho Newsom as the nominee. Because you can't possibly think that Biden, Mr. Segregation, sitting down to eat fried chicken with some black people is going to be a vote winner. I mean, no one's going to fall for that. It's so racist. It reminded me of Birth of a Nation, which I'm sure Biden still has a screening of every Christmas. Right, where are we? DE says it certainly takes a few headlines and takes attention away from the Ukraine's Charlie Sheen winning strategy. Yes, that's correct. Potted Rodent says libs are nothing if not completely predictable. Very true. Rob says Western bourgeois press and politicians are even more unhinged than they claim Putin to be, or at least some sort of, or at least give some sort of pretense of considering the evidence first. Yeah, well, they're never going to do that. They're living in an alternative universe. They used to mock, liberals used to mock George W. Bush and co. When I believe it was Karl Rove who said, we create our own reality. Well, he was just acknowledging what they all do, which is that they've curated very carefully their own reality. Now, the thing is, you're not supposed to believe that yourself. You're supposed to be, as the propagandist who's putting this stuff out there, you're supposed to be fully aware of the actual reality. This is just an image you're presenting to the rubes, to the suckers, to the people who are going to be frightened and bullied and bribed into voting for you at some point. You're not supposed to engage in it yourself, but unfortunately for the propagandists of the West, they've all started to believe their own stories, which is always a dangerous point to reach. What would a PSL government in the USA look like? Asks Comrade Hello Hi. Chaotic, to say the least. Probably much like Joe Biden's government, to be honest. Pittsburgh Dudes answers the comrade's question by saying mandatory COVID jabs and drag queen story hour for kids. Yeah, that'll be about the only two things that the PSL actually stand for. So, where are we now? Jawad says, though NATO, Europe and US would use Navalny issue to secure further aid for Ukraine government, it would never match the initial madness. Yes, I mean, everything is an attempt to just keep it going. Pro-Navalny demos outside the Russian embassy in Belgrade, says Gillian. Well, I bet that's got about 5 people at it. The same 5 people who were there at the anti-Vucic demo a few weeks ago. Rian joins late, but he's joining us from the Socialist Republic of Wales. Good to have you with us. Right. Comrade Hello Hi says, I wonder what the Leon Sedov brigades would think of this situation. Perhaps they could explain why they think a certain group with a black flag is permanent revolution or something. Don't know. I mean, usually if trots are confronted with inconvenient facts, they just start screaming incoherently. They would probably say that the main problem is removing the disgusting bureaucratic authoritarian regime of Assad, and therefore that is the reason why a tactical alliance with ISIS is necessary or something. Didn't the BBC Media Action train Ukraine and Syrian media outlets? Yes, that's true. Media training is one of the big ways in which regime change operations are funded and prepared for. So if you look at look back at the conversation I had with Don Corter from the Revolution Report when he was in Georgia covering events down there. He was saying to me that one of the big things there was that the US, through the National Endowment for Democracy, etc., was training Georgians in how to do so-called citizen journalism, which is basically how to be, an active video blogger with your phone. So that's always been a big part of how they prepare for color revolution ops, going all the way back to the operation against Milosevic in 2000 with the Otpor group. And an Irish partisan says, I recall being at a seminar in the American University of Bulgaria as an undergraduate given by a Bulgarian government minister who said that if Bulgaria joined EU NATO, everything would be fixed. 20 years later, Bulgaria has been further deindustrialized and depopulated, still ruled over by a parasitic comprador elite. Yeah. Well, everything will be fixed. He didn't say for who, though, comrade, did he? So everything will be fixed for the ruling class, which was that they would get permanent access to the funding streams made available through the EU, to shall we say, an easy escape inside the United States, whereas the country gets completely fucked, as Irish Partisan has noted in his comment. Well, I think to answer Martin's point about the fall of the Soviet Union, basically meaning the intelligentsia is completely captured, it was partially captured before the fall of the USSR. Remember and this all goes back to a root, which is the Khrushchev group and their restoration of capitalism inside the USSR, or I shouldn't say capitalism, I should say more accurately, capitalist production methods, their ending of the dictatorship of the proletariat. All of this helped to, if not usher back in capitalism, prepare the ground for it, and also prepare the ground for it on an intellectual basis, so that you notice that particularly after the late 70s into the early 80s, the propaganda against imperialism, and I say propaganda in a good sense, is becoming more and more bland, less and less coherent. The training of the cadres in opposing imperialism becomes far worse. The question of so-called peaceful coexistence is pushed. And what you get, of course, is a group who, emerging inside the Soviet and in people's democracies, party leaderships and intelligentsia, who are relentlessly dedicated to actually serving US imperialism. Why? Because they've adopted a wholly bourgeois outlook. And, of course, they have come to believe that the planned economies are a huge barrier to their material progression. And because, as always, with people who adopt a bourgeois point of view, they adopt the point of view that they are the universal class. And so, therefore, somebody who becomes pro-capitalist inside Russia or the wider Soviet Union or the people's democracies, who's in the nomenclatura or the intelligentsia, they adopt a pro-capitalist point of view, and therefore they see themselves as the universal subjects, and therefore anything which is good for them, why, therefore it must be good for the country. So if the country has to get deindustrialized and depopulated, well, you can always find ideological reasons to be grasped at as to why that's justified. Maybe it needed to be deindustrialized so it could become part of the glorious deindustrialized, post-industrial, post-human future of the Western world. Perhaps it needed to be depopulated because of various theories around overpopulation. Yeah, maybe there were just too many people. It was making things inefficient. Once you've decided that you, as an so-called intellectual, as a leader of a particular intelligentsia, are the true representative of the nation, divorced from the proletariat, even if you're nominally in a party which is upholding socialism, then anything can be justified. It's also worth stating that once the power of the working class needs to be restored here, because of course Bulgarian, Polish, Romanian capitalism was always a stunted and deformed and entity which came too late onto the scene the first time round. So by the time we got to the second time round and capitalist restoration in the East, it was just a completely wretched foreign imposed abomination. Capitalism was, that was very easily controlled by the US imperialists and the German imperialists as well. And so all because of the material root of capitalist restoration is in a tiny minority, and a tiny parasitic minority, which is not capable of taking the nation forward. They're just complete slaves of the imperialist powers and are never going to be anything other than that. And so the cultures they dwell in are just completely degenerate and designed only around justifying their own existence and justifying their own lack of development of the nation. Nuclear poison, yeah, polonium. That was what they said that Lugovoy killed Litvinenko with in London. Chris Sabo says, why deny the proletarian part of MAGA? Honestly, the more progressive movement in the US today. I never denied, Chris, that there were workers who supported Trump and the MAGA movement. I've never denied that. The question I've always raised is in the best way to relate to such workers if you're a communist. They made out Putin wanted to invade Finland in the early days. Yeah, it's a ridiculous assertion. Answering DE's comment. BBC News at 10 coverage of Navalny was so over the top and embarrassing. He was portrayed as Gandhi and Mandela in one man, clearly aimed at Ukraine flag-waving liberals. No one else buys this. Yes, that's true. It's only aimed at bolstering support amongst those who are sort of petty bourgeois types who desperately want to believe that the crusade in Ukraine can win. The working class, I think, overwhelmingly just won't go for it. They won't pay attention to it. Their minds won't be changed by it. It's all about convincing the petty bourgeois. Because fundamentally, capitalist rule in the imperialist countries, or indeed any capitalist country, particularly here we're considering Britain, that is based on the ability of the bourgeois politicians to manipulate a petty bourgeois political base and keep the working class's role in Britain is not to be active at all, it's to be continually passive. And if the working class starts to mobilize in any significant way, that's always regarded as a problem. So propaganda is always directed principally in two directions: keeping the petty bourgeoisie running around a maze like a sort of mouse looking for some cheese, and keeping the proletariat completely pacified and completely demoralized and inert. Right. Off topic, have you ever listened to Dan Carlin's hardcore history, particularly to the World War II stuff? Very anti-communist from what I remember. No, I have never bothered myself with it, to be honest. It always looked like an anti-communist bit of a joke. All the pro-EU people are saying the Russia-funded politicians thing again. Yes, of course they are, because these are the most propagandized people in Britain, comrade Hello Hi. They are the most taken in easily by stories because, again, the thing that motivates them more than anything else is wanting to have a nice holiday in Europe. So like these comfortably off people with liberal sensibilities when it comes to domestic issues, but are ferociously anti-working class and very imperialist, they're willing to believe anything about how Brexit happened, except for, of course, how it actually happened, which was it was a stirring of a working class revolt against a system they despise and which despises them right back. But your average liberal doesn't want to have that discussion. Irish Partisan says, a number of my old comrades from the Workers' Party of Ireland visited Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Baltics in the late 80s, where they were met with hostility from local petty bourgeois who supported Thatcher. Good point. Workers' Party of Ireland are part of a European Communist Action and World Anti-Imperialist Platform at the same time. Greek Communist L once again. Yes, and I should say, of course, that I was in Ireland earlier this week on Thursday and early Friday, addressing a meeting of the Trinity College Dublin branch of the Workers' Party, and my thanks to those who invited me over to that. A very interesting discussion was had there. I hope that the talk that I gave held some interest and was able to offer some opinions for discussion on the potential for Irish unity there as well. Very interesting evening. And again, thank the comrades for the invite and the several pints of Guinness afterwards. So, any future predictions on what might come from revolutionary movements in the West or just Britain, asks Banana Bender. Well, you don't ask easy questions, do you? Well, look, I mean, to answer your question in brief, in Britain, it'll be a case of probably a messy kind of class-based revolt will come. The ruling class is going to work very hard to channel all frustrations into anti-immigrant sentiment. That's certainly something that they're going to do. So they're going to try and racialize it all, but they're going to the class-based revolt is in the pipeline. It's just a question of when it hits and how it hits. So in terms of our activity as communists in Britain, well, our job is to essentially build the red zones wherever we can, get active in the working class areas, which the British left isn't and hasn't been interested in, for decades. So go back to the Lenin quote, go lower and deeper into the masses, get away from the labor aristocracy and the hierarchy of the trade union movement, start to organize in areas where the British left just isn't interested in. So it will be a slow process, but I think one that's not going to be quite as slow as many people think. The authority of the British state, the moral authority that it has within the population, I don't think it's ever been weaker, to be honest. I think it's weaker now than it was even prior to the population getting the vote. So the damage that a potential revolt could do is potentially devastating. So the whole question then over potential revolts in the imperialist countries, I mean, I'll leave the United States for another day because I think it's a different situation over there. Some similarities, though. But the question in Britain is, for us, establishing ourselves firmly in working class areas. This is in working class communities, not mistaking activity in the trade union bureaucracy for activity within the working class. Building ourselves up there, readying ourselves for the moment when revolts start to happen, and hopefully then having enough roots in enough working class areas to actually exercise some influence when things start to seriously deteriorate, which they will quite soon. So again, like, revolts will emerge. They often be chaotic. The bourgeoisie will try to divert them into all kinds of places, such as mostly racialized, anti-immigrant stuff, anti-Muslim stuff. You name it, they'll try and divert energy into it. Which is, again, why communists must start the difficult and sometimes frustrating process, but necessary process of firmly establishing ourselves back in working class areas again, in a way that hasn't been done since the old days of the old CPGB back in the 20s, 30s and 40s, where they were actually an organization that did base themselves in the working class. And after that, though, with the drift towards revisionism, they just became a party of the trade union bureaucracy. But I think we probably need an episode on future revolutionary movements in the imperialist countries, with particular regard being paid to the US. Perhaps it's time. I think we need to get a guest on to talk about that, though. I wouldn't want to just freestyle it myself. The CPGBML will one day take power, says Comrade Hello Hi. Well, we do aim to do so, and if you're interested in joining that particular quest, then be sure to join the party. We need to take a look at the third world. Well, Bernardo Bender's question there is an apt one, but I'd say the colonized countries, or the countries subjected to neo-colonial domination, have shown that they are more than capable of revolt and are probably going to be out ahead of the game than the imperialist countries are. So yeah, we do need to look at them, but I think the question of, like, developing revolutionary strategies in imperialist countries is going to be a very important one given where things stand right now. So certainly we will endeavor to look at both, as we've looked at the Sahel particularly over the last year, but there's other places to look at too. We will need to look at the recent result in Indonesia as well. I'm aware that that's been mentioned quite a bit. Tories went for Brexit, says Jawad, because they know no matter what the outcome, they can play on it for years to come. Well, Cameron declared the referendum because there was a crisis in his party. Boris backed Leave because he thought it wouldn't win, and he, as you say, Jawad, in your comment, would be able to then play on that for years to come. They never thought that it would win. Winning was a disaster for them. It was a disaster for the City of London, etc. Brexit was meant to be a continued running saw that the various different right-wing elements in the Conservative Party would big up to try and generate enthusiasm for themselves. That's why Boris wanted it. He never actually wanted it to happen. He wanted to use it to elevate himself to become Conservative Party leader, and then he could go over there to Europe, he could bang on the table and scream and shout and demand concessions and maybe get a few, and then he'd be back to chatting in French with Macron about, I don't know, common incidents when they were at a public school or something like that. It was never meant to actually win. It was meant to be just something that was used to manipulate people. But people seized on it because it was a way of expressing anger at the system, which is one of the reasons why I was enthusiastic to back it, and one of the reasons I'd back it all over again if I had to make the same decision process through. Hello to LazyBones79, who says, "You're welcome for the Guinness. The Workers' Party is a member of the World Anti-Imperialist Platform. We are not in the revisionist ECI. There are some former members interfering with our Wikipedia page." And that's a reference back to an earlier comment. So yes, the Workers' Party of Ireland is a member of the World Anti-Imperialist Platform. So if you don't know what they stand for, go to their website and find out. And President Jesus says, "Joining late, do you think Gavin Newsom has Bonapartist potential?" I think if Gavin Newsom had a brain, he'd be dangerous. But I think that if they install him via some kind of machination at the Democratic Party convention this year, well, it's going to be a difficult one because, I mean, he's not that popular in California if the accounts I've read can be believed. Though I believe President Jesus is a resident of the Sunshine State. All right, is that California or Florida? But installing him would, of course, get rid of the old man Biden. It would look as if he was a fresh face, particularly if he's had another round of plastic surgery. You should pair him up, ideally, with a female candidate for vice president. And then you try and portray a sort of campaign based on substanceless optimism against Trump. Well, it could work. I would still say, though, that Trump has the momentum. But putting in Newsom at least gives them something different to say. And if Biden carries the can for the Israel's crimes, which he should, by the way, but Newsom would do all the same things, then you could portray it as a fresh start, and you could hope to get some of those Arab American voters and Muslim voters back in the Great Lakes states. California is the Golden State, apparently. So I mean, Newsom, if he got in, would of course govern in an increasingly Bonapartist fashion. But so that's the same is true of every presidential administration for decades now. It'll become more Bonapartist, of course, as the crisis increases. Now, having a guy with good hair do the Bonapartism stuff rather than old man Biden or Trump, yeah, that'd appeal to a certain section of the U.S. ruling class, but. Again, whether he has that much popularity to be able to pull this thing off is another question. I thought that DeSantis might be able to do it, but it turned out he was a complete dud. Lisa says, "This might sound crazy, but I think the robo-dogs will replace the police to be used against a popular revolt." They're nowhere near the stage where that's viable. Like the technology for like the robot dog thing, and sort of robo-cops, quite literally. Like, a lot of that is advertising, and a lot of it is like wildly over-talking the technological breakthroughs that have been made. Yeah, they'd love to have a security force that just automatically machine guns people, but then again, that creates a certain problem. Like, as RoboCop itself showed, and maybe we can do a film review of this in the future, like, one of the reasons why civilian policing, so-called, under capitalism is introduced is not just to have a force that can club people over the head. You can have any force do that. Is that you introduce it because you want to draw from the working class in order to police the working class, and the police agencies need to have a degree of authority based upon the idea that they are ultimately enforcing the law for your benefit. If it's just replaced by a robot that machine guns you if you step out of line, then that's a big step down for capitalism. And they won't want to just replace civilian policing with an outright militarist dictatorship yet. That may come in the future, depending upon the depth of the crisis. But I think there's two drawbacks there. The technological one, which I think that these things are nowhere near where they would need to be to do that. But the bigger one is the political problem it presents. DF says, maybe a little off topic, but what's your opinion on Eric Hobsbawm? I'm currently reading The Age of Extremes. After listening to your podcast, I get the impression he's rather anti-communist. Well, he was a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain. Not that that means you can't be an anti-communist. Like all of that layer of the sort of the great Communist Party historians, so Christopher Hill, Eric Hobsbawm, E.P. Thompson, Hobsbawm remained in the Communist Party, but the Communist Party became so like revisionist and Euro-communist that it basically became anti-communist. I'm not sure where Hill's trajectory took him, but certainly Thompson became an anti-communist. Because again, these were all guys who were in British bourgeois academia, and with the degeneration of the Communist Party after the 1951 and the impact of Khrushchevite revisionism, all these guys basically just decayed into becoming social democrats. And that's why the last book in that quartet, which is Age of Extremes, is one that she's just shrouded in pessimism and anti-communism, because that's where that layer had gone in the late 1980s and early 1990s. They'd become openly anti-communist. Very interesting, the Greek Communist Party also took a reactionary stance recently. Could you specify on what particular point? I mean, they've been taking reactionary stances over the special military operation and various other questions for a number of years. Their interpretation of imperialism is also ridiculous. Looking at his face is like Uncanny Valley. I think that's a reference to Gavin Newsom from Banana Bender there. Revolution Report Comrade is in the chat. He says, I don't think Gavin Newsom is that popular outside California. I don't think he's that popular inside California, except with certain people. Stefan Sechot says, the machines are expensive. They will never work. Proles will strip them in no time. Yeah, they won't be able to do what they think they can do with them. We have an anti-communist in the chat who says, don't let other people oppress you. Power-grabbing evil. Good stuff. Communism, vomit face. Well, I think the spirit of Solzhenitsyn is among us. Perhaps you should send that image to Putin. I'm sure he'd agree with you. Robert Griffiths will be a cyborg. Maybe he already is. Oh, it was regard to same-sex marriage that the Greek communists took a reactionary stance. Well, to be honest with you, once you've decided that you've created a fantasy version of imperialism, basically anything's possible. I think there was some pandering to the Greek Orthodox Church there, or certain elements within it, just as the KPRF panders to the Russian Orthodox Church, and they shouldn't do, by the way. Dingo Ate Me Baby says, Israel has a company making the robot dogs with either 7.62 NATO or 6.5mm Grendel sniper rifle on it, and some with belt-fed light machine guns or 40mm grenade launchers, all still human-controlled. Yeah, but this is the thing. I mean, our correspondent there may well be correct. I have no reason to assume that he's not telling the truth there. Israel will be is the primary country pushing this shit. But look, they thought they had the most high-tech system in the world that guaranteed that no revolt would ever succeed out of Gaza, and look what happened. It all got swept away. Like, you rely completely on technology for this. It'll get destroyed. Like, you can't have the level of like murderous efficiency they would need to make this shit work just isn't present, and won't be either. I mean, fundamentally, all this shit that Israel sells, all the spy tech stuff, all the high-tech repression stuff, all got exposed as completely fucking useless with a determined move from the Palestinian National Liberation Forces. And Israel got exposed as basically selling contricks to people, which is what they were. High-tech contricks, but contricks nonetheless. Steve Choate says, Ringgold, Georgia. I presume that's where you are. Very glad I found you. Been catching up on your past videos. Thank you. Well, good to have you with us. So, yes, we are approaching an hour and a half in, so done some Q&A. Just to mention a couple of other things. I mean, the important thing happening in the Ukraine war is, of course, the fact that the Avdiivka, the big fortified stronghold from which shelling of Donetsk City has been done for the last 10 years now, has finally fallen to the Russian forces, though of course fighting is still going on. There's talk of large-scale surrenders by Ukrainian forces that have been left without ammunition, without food, and without orders for many, many days, if not weeks. So this is a situation which of course is repeated all the way up and down the front line. The Ukrainian forces are increasingly out of ammunition, out of supplies, out of time. So it's just a question now of, well, what do the Russians do to press home their advantage? Are we going to get, at some point, a much wider Russian assault that will aim to circle around Kharkov and take that, and go down to Odessa, because seemingly that is one of the endpoints that has been mentioned. And what are they going to do about Kiev? Is it the case that ultimately, as I have predicted, possibly at risk to my own reputation, of that they're going to end up with taking Kiev and leaving like the Lvov regime to NATO and the EU in the West? That was my prediction last week. So we'll have to see what kind of follow-up that this victory is what kind of maneuvers that the Russians follow up this victory of theirs with. So Jawad says, exactly right, the AI robots cannot be employed in the domestic, I think you were going to say, situation there. Dingo Ate Me Baby is making appeals for electromagnetic pulse guns. I'd like to say that this channel does not associate itself with that request, or his subsequent one for a flamethrower. This is an independent actor, not under the control of the Marx Engels Lenin Institute, of course. Legal disclaimer given. We will continue. Irish partisan is off to the pub. Well, have a pint on us. Okay, so Avdiivka, things to keep an eye on there. I mean, I think we'll come back to the Israel question tomorrow, because I want to re-emphasize the point about what is going on there. So we've been going for an hour and 40. I'm going to call it quits there. Thank you to everybody who has tuned in for what is a very active discussion in the chat, as always. This will find its way onto the Patreon page very, very soon. And if you have further questions, we'll be back online tomorrow. So thank you again to everybody who's tuned in. And now back over to your musical mixtape.